Hello everyone, welcome to the Tech Talk on Apache APISIX. Just to give you a gist about APISIX, Apache APISIX is our popular API gateway and a top level project at Apache Software Foundation. Today we have with us Navendu from the APISIX community. Navendu is one of the maintainer of Apache APISIX, currently working as a developer advocate at API7.ai. Along with the work, he has been mentoring new contributors through various open source initiatives like Google Summer of Code, LFX mentorship program.
Thanks Aditya and thanks Satish for organizing this whole event. I'm really happy to be the first one to try out this new format of Tech Talks. Really great to have you all here. So let's get started. Okay, so while we wait, I was really happy to hear that a lot of people wanted to learn more about APISIX. This is pretty exciting. And to go off on a tangent, we have just started an Apache local community in Bangalore, which is with hopes to promote and educate people more about Apache Software Foundation projects. So APISIX is definitely one of the projects that we are planning to have a community around in Bangalore. So today I want to talk about APISIX and give just an introduction to what APISIX is and what its capabilities are as an API gateway. This talk will not be too long, and this is just a very high-level introduction. I'll just go over some of the concepts and do a demo on the capabilities of APISIX. And all of you in these meetings are really experienced software architects, so you should be able to take what you learned from this talk and then pick up APISIX and then go do your own thing with that. And if you are on the opposite end, if you are a new developer or someone who has less experience with similar things, then this talk is also for you because it is very high level. We discuss a lot of concepts and it is simple enough that you have some takeaway, whoever you are. So with that in mind, let's get started. So as Aditya mentioned, I work on the Apache APISIX project as my job. So it's a pretty nice job. I used to work on some CNCF projects related to service meshes, mostly similar stuff related to networking stuff. And I also try to help open source contributors uh, contribute to open source projects like APISIX and projects in the Linux Foundation through some of these open source mentorship programs. And you can find me on Twitter. I just realized that I changed my username on Twitter yesterday, but never mind. You should be able to find me online, or I'm on the WhatsApp group. Another fact about me is that I'm not a Java developer. So when Satish reached out to me to talk about APISIX, one of the things he mentioned was people can get too involved in the Java ecosystem and uh, kind of become myopic. I truly understand that, because whenever I work in a particular technology, I tend to focus only on that and forget about the other alternatives, even though they might be a better solution for me. But me not being a Java developer might be a feature in this talk, because uh, maybe this can give a different perspective uh, on this problem of API management, on this problem of traffic management. So yeah. So if you have Java questions, I'll be happy to refer to someone else in my team, but feel free to ask questions at any point during the talk. I will try to keep an eye on the chat, and then I'll try to answer questions as we go on. Anything about APISIX, anything related to all of these, feel free to ask them. APISIX is a high performance cloud native API gateway, and it is hosted within the Apache Software Foundation, and that means it has an Apache license. It is a very permissive license, and it will always be supported by the Software Foundation, regardless of who works on the project, or if companies back in the project decide to pivot or decide to leave the project, or God forbid go bankrupt. So yeah, APISIX is a high performance cloud native API gateway And we have two terms here, API gateway and cloud native. Let's see what these actually mean. So what does it mean to be an API gateway? What is an API gateway? So to put it simply, an API gateway sits between your client applications, which this could be your applications, mobile apps, web apps, Android apps, anything. And it sits between these applications and your APIs, your backend, your services. It could be microservices, it could be a collection of multiple APIs, anything. So an API gateway sits between the two and acts as a single entry point for all your traffic from your clients. And its job is to route these traffic to your backend APIs. And it does a lot of stuff as we'll learn. So it takes an application user's request, routes it to one or more backend services, and it gathers all the data needed to fulfill that particular request from the client and delivers it to the user in a single package. So you tell the API gateway what you want, and the API gateway figures out all the API that is needed to fulfill this request and collects all the responses and sends them back to the client. And on top of on top of this basic routing capability, it also provides like analytics, security, and like other features, like fine-grained traffic control and so on. So yeah, with that in mind, like so, when a client application sends a request to API gateway, it has a lot of features within it that lets you manipulate the request, that lets you analyze the request, that lets you decide how to route this request, and doing all after all of that, it sends the request to the appropriate service in your backend and then gets you back the response. So let's look at some patterns or like architecture patterns that are most common with API gateways, so that like you get an idea of what is capable with an API gateway or what is capable with Apache APISIX. So the first thing is authentication. So when a user sends a request to your API, if you have an API gateway like Apache APISIX in front, you can use it to authenticate requests. So user can in on the simple side, a user can let's say send a JWT token to Apache APISIX to verify, to validate who it is, to make sure that the request is authenticated, and APISIX validates that request. And if it is coming from a trusted source, APISIX can then route requests to your backends. So and APISIX can also integrate with other third-party identity providers. You can use APISIX to let users sign in and get a key value pair from a third-party service and then use it to authenticate and so on. So once you authenticate, APISIX has the user info. So you can also do something like you can also tailor your backend services to particular users. Perhaps one of your client users who is from a particular company might be the only one who has access to certain number of your APIs. So you can validate those users with Apache APISIX and get their user info from the request, and then tailor what backend is exposed to them with Apache APISIX. Another thing on a different side of the spectrum is rate limiting. So rate limiting is a quite trivial use case, and APISIX or other API gateways are able to achieve that quite intelligently. So in the most simplest of terms, you can set a threshold. Let's say you can set a threshold for number of requests that can be made in a minute, or you can also set like a number of requests per second. You can also set number of parallel connections that a client can have to the API. So you can set all these limits within Apache APISIX, And when the number of users or requests exceeds this particular threshold, you can use APISIX can actually reject these requests or delay these requests so that your backend, your upstream services, uh, get the appropriate amount of traffic that they can handle. So
Naveen, can
yeah,
we ask questions?
yeah, sure.
So yeah, one you said API 6, but all your slides have APS 7.ai. Is this a new version?
Yeah, that's yeah. Thank you for asking that. So Apache APISIX is the open source project under the Apache Software Foundation. The project was originally written by API 7.ai, the company, and they decided to donate it to the Apache Software Foundation. So it's just a API 7 was named API 7 because to associate itself with Apache API 6. So it's name trickery, I guess. So I work for API 7, and I work on the Apache API 6 project. But yeah, as I'll mention later, like API 7 offers a lot of uh, additional features like an enterprise version of API 6, um, an API portal with API 6, and a lot more other products. So, yeah, like one of the concerns most people have when adopting open source software is like, uh, is the support they
Support.
expect to receive? Yeah, and like the ease of deployment and all the other stuff. So API 7 is the like fastest way in which you can adopt API 6 and get the enterprise support that big companies or like critical companies building critical software might need. So yeah,
And
I'll just touch upon that at the end. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
what is the significance of this 6 and 7?
Yeah. 6 is actually a lucky number in China. So most of the original authors of Apache APISIX are in China. So they decided to call it 6 API for API application programming interface and 6 for the lucky number 6. And then 7 is just so that we are associated to API 6.
Upgrade. Upgrade.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And what are the other popular gateways, API gateways?
Yeah, so there are a lot of API gateway providers, both open source and uh, proprietary stuff. And most cloud providers like GCP, AWS, and Azure have their own API gateways within it. And there are also like other open source API gateways.
Is Mule also a part of it? Mule have something, right? Mule, you heard of Mule?
Uh,
Salesforce.
MuleSoft.
Yeah, they
Okay.
have.
Okay. Uh, yeah. I believe like most cloud providers have some sort of API gateway implementations within them. At least like even though they won't specify API gateway explicitly, like maybe uh, an API gateway resides within their load balancers, like having additional features like capability to route traffic and like mm, do other stuff like authentication and security. So yeah, I guess most cloud providers will have some sort of API gateway solution available.
Yeah, do you mind going to previous slide? One question I have.
Yeah, sure.
So now you mentioned user info and then permissions. Now, does it mean that, I mean, is it advisable that each service should not have any authentication, totally rely upon gateways? Or do you still recommend both of them to be there?
Uh, do, do you mean like so if someone has access to the API gateway, uh,
Yeah, let API gateway
yeah.
know whether X who has logged in. If he's not logged in, it will take care of login. And once he's logged in, whether he has a permission, only when the permission comes, it goes to corresponding services.
Yeah,
Should that logic be there in the gateway, or even each service also should protect itself?
yeah, that's a really good question. From from the current cloud native, like the talks in the cloud native architecture thing, there are uh, there are two places where you might want to enforce security. One is the application boundary, and that is handled by an API gateway like Apache APISIX. So the assumption is that everything uh, everything to the right of this, all your services, uh, your whole backend is secure, and API gateway is the only entry point into that service. So if you have a single entry point, then it can be the place where you enforce security. But there are also cases where you have tons of microservices and like you have an entire cloud native or a large cloud native architecture. In situations, let's say, where you have a large distributed team and people are working from all over the world, and they are working on each of the team are working on different services, and all of these services are talking to each other, and like it's a whole microservice architecture. In some of those scenarios, you might also want to protect service to service communications as well. So in such scenarios, a lot of people have been using service meshes, which is like an API gateway for each of your service. I have written about how you can use APISIX as a service mesh in an article. So I'll probably link to that. But in general, like you can do a lot of stuff. And within APISIX itself is you can do stuff like mutual TLS. So you can enforce TLS between the client to client APISIX communication as well as APISIX to service communication. So enforcing mutual TLS uh, also adds a layer of security on top of that. Coming back to the rate limit, so you have a threshold. If the number of users exceeds that threshold, you either reject it or delay it for some time so that your backend, your upstream, your APIs are able to handle that request. So this can be quite useful in a business sense where you want to rate limit your consumers, rate limit your API consumers, but it is also an important aspect when it comes to reliability and security. So when you think about denial of service attacks where your API is flooded with a lot of traffic, having a rate limiter in an API gateway ensures that your backend can still remain healthy and serve the appropriate number of requests that it can. And the API gateway handles all the rejection and delays. Another interesting thing that you can do with an API gateway is canary release. So in a canary release, you are trying to deploy a new version of your API. And as you can see, you have your upstream or your API version v1.0, and then you have v2.0. Initially, all the traffic is being routed to v1.0, and now you want to release v2.0, but you want to make sure that the release goes smoothly and there are no bugs. Sometimes like you want to test this new version of the API with uh, production traffic, and then if there are any issues, you might want to roll back to v1.0 and fix these issues, right? So an APISIX lets you do that uh, traffic splitting. So initially you can have most traffic routed to v1.0 and then only some traffic to v2.0, and then you can test this new version of the API, make sure that the responses, the logs, and everything matches. You can do some telemetry on the new version, and once you're sure that uh, it's good to go, you can change the uh, these weights and route most traffic to the v2.0 and keep v1.0 on standby. And now once you move all traffic to the new version, if you still face any issues, you can always use an API gateway to roll back to v1.0 without interrupting the users. So there is no downtime. you are gradually routing traffic from v1.0 to v2.0. And if you face any issues, you can gradually route traffic back to the v1.0 without without letting your clients know of any interruptions. The interesting thing that is like that is similar to all of these stuff is circuit breaking, which might not be a trivial use case of an API gateway. Let's say you have multiple versions of an upstream of an API, and APISIX is load balancing traffic between all three versions of the upstream. So they do the same thing, but like you have multiple instances of it for scale. So let's say if the first upstream, it fails for some reason, it crashes. So when APISIX tries to, or any other API gateway or load balancer, when it tries to route traffic to the shutdown upstream, it receives an error. What could happen is that these errors could cascade to other services. So APISIX will keep trying this upstream, and it will keep sending let's say an error status code, and like it won't give you back the response it needs. And this could cause a bottleneck here, and this bottleneck could cascade to other services as well. So what an API gateway like APISIX can do is like it can check the health of your upstream services, and if these services are not functioning properly, APISIX can disconnect from these services and wait for it to go back to a working condition. And while it is restarting, or like while it is resetting things up, APISIX will only route traffic to upstreams that are healthy, and it acts like a circuit breaker in an electrical circuit. It disconnects the faulty components to make sure that the healthy components also don't get affected. The interesting thing about reliability is that like reliability does not always mean reliability of your backend services. It also means how reliable your services are to your consumers. So something like a thing that happens quite frequently is like the API provider, they change their API, and this disrupts client applications. I like to think that like any change in your API can disrupt client applications, because if you don't have control of the client applications, then you won't know how your API is actually being used by your clients. So there is always a possibility of changes in your API breaking things in the client side. So APISIX can like redirect traffic. So if a user still uses an old API endpoint, APISIX can send a deprecation notice and then redirect with a 300 status code to the new API endpoint. So, and it can also do stuff like map request bodies in old API format to new API formats, and do stuff like that. There are a lot of articles and documentation on the APISIX website. You can definitely check that out. But yeah, something that might feel trivial, but that is quite useful in a real world scenario is also a practical thing to do in APISIX. And finally, monitoring. And since we are talking about reliability, monitoring also is quite key when it comes to ensuring reliability, because you are only as good as your monitoring services, because you want to know if there are any issues within your backend services, within your API gateway. Like you want to make sure that everything is up and running, and for that you need robust monitoring solutions. So APISIX is the single entry point, or any API gateway for that matter is the single entry point to all your services. So it can be a good place to set up monitoring, because it has access to all the traffic. And APISIX does this by integrating with a lot of open specifications like the open telemetry specifications. It also works with Apache Skywalking. You can export metrics from APISIX to Skywalking, and you can also directly export stuff to Prometheus, which works very well with dashboard systems like Grafana, which lets you like set up a monitoring and alerting systems uh, with the metrics collected from APISIX, and also for tracers. So tracers, logs, and metrics are popularly called the three pillars of observability. And APISIX for tracers, APISIX is the entry point to the traffic. So APISIX can generate the trace ID and like get you from APISIX you can get the whole trace of the request through your services, and this can be quite useful. APISIX also can also export logs, so it can export logs to like HTTP servers, TCP servers. It can log to a particular file, all sort of stuff. I recently wrote an article about how you can use APISIX with the Elastic Stack. So the Elastic Stack is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. It's a popular stack for observability. So you can export large number of logs from APISIX and make sense of that through Elasticsearch and Kibana. So you can get a lot of data through these logs, through these monitoring solutions. And APISIX tends to work with most of the stuff. The second part of our discussion was the cloud native aspect of Apache APISIX. So I guess like everyone is talking about cloud native, and the key part of cloud native is the Kubernetes cluster. And whatever examples we mentioned assumed APISIX was deployed independently, but APISIX can also be deployed inside a Kubernetes cluster. So your APIs become pods and services within a Kubernetes cluster. And you also have APISIX API gateway inside the Kubernetes cluster. And clients talk to APISIX, talks to APISIX, and then APISIX routes traffic like all the examples we mentioned before. And yeah, and a key part about deploying APISIX in Kubernetes is to make it Kubernetes native. So by Kubernetes native, I mean APISIX should be able to be managed similarly managed how you manage a pod or a service within Kubernetes. So it should be Kubernetes native. You should be able to use a Kubernetes resource, use the Kubernetes API to configure APISIX, and you can just use the Kubernetes client to apply that Kubernetes configuration into the Kubernetes cluster, and Kubernetes cluster would take care of the rest. And APISIX does this through the APISIX ingress controller, which is another project, which is basically a wrapper around APISIX. So the APISIX ingress controller takes the APISIX configuration defined in Kubernetes native format and then converts it to the API, the format APISIX understands. So it is just APISIX API gateway with a wrapper called the ingress controller on top of it. This project is also completely open source, and like you can definitely check it out. Yeah, but I'll leave that here and then do a small demo just to show like how you can deploy APISIX and then configure a basic route. So I have a Docker Compose file. So if you are testing out APISIX, you can spin up APISIX using a Docker image. On a side note, I have been using OrbStack recently for spinning up Docker containers instead of Docker Desktop. I think it is pretty good. I'm not this is not a sponsor message. I'm just genuinely happy that I'm using it, and it is completely free. So yeah, I have spun up APISIX, an APISIX container. So we have Apache APISIX, And Apache APISIX uses etcd, etcd as its configuration manager. etcd is the APISIX uses etcd to store configuration. And yeah, etcd is like a distributed key value store. So it is quite robust when it comes to scalability. So you can deploy etcd in clusters, and these clusters can scale independently of APISIX. So your configuration won't be lost as things scale. But you can also use other databases, or you can also deploy APISIX without a database and just use a static configuration files, something that you might want to do when you are deploying APISIX in production. But for now, like, we'll deploy APISIX and etcd, and we'll use APISIX's API, which is called the admin API, and we'll use that API to configure APISIX. And I also have two sample applications, which are just bare Nginx servers running. One is V1 and one is V2. We'll try to set up a canary deployment. I'll try to show you a traffic split with APISIX. So this is the Docker Compose file. We are using Apache APISIX image. And APISIX has a configuration file, which we usually call the config.yaml file. And it tells how APISIX should be deployed. So yeah, we are deploying APISIX in a traditional mode. You can also deploy APISIX in a standalone mode. You can also separate APISIX data plane and control plane, have multiple data planes, all sort of stuff as you scale. But we will use the traditional deployment mode, and we will use etcd as our configuration manager. And we will tell APISIX where etcd is deployed. And that's pretty much it. And yeah, and we spin up etcd, we spin up two Nginx servers, and the Nginx, these sample applications, these V1 and V2 applications, they just return a message that says it is from V1. That's it. All right. So I just spun up all these using the Docker Compose command. So Docker Compose up, and all of this is running. There is also a quick start script, APISIX script in the APISIX website. You can check the getting started guide to know that. You can just run a simple script on your shell, and it will spin up APISIX. All right. Okay, first let's configure. Oh yeah. So this is the admin API. So APISIX is deployed at port 9180. And this is how you access the admin API. Let's see if we have any routes. So now there are no routes in APISIX, but we have APISIX deployed and all of our applications deployed. And now if we try to access the gateway, let's see. Let's see, products. So it says there is no route found. So let's try to create this products route in APISIX. And let's see. So I call the admin API again. So I make a put request with the configuration in JSON in the request body. So yeah, this is the configuration that I typed out. So yeah, so the URI is /products. So APISIX will match all requests to the path products. And we are using something called APISIX plugins. And this is another feature of APISIX's architecture. Everything is pluggable in APISIX. APISIX is written in Lua, and you can extend APISIX with your own custom features. You can extend APISIX with some additional plugins provided by the APISIX community itself. And these plugins add additional features to APISIX. So everything in APISIX is essentially a plugin, and you can also create your own plugins. And stay tuned because you can also write APISIX plugins in Java. So yeah, so we have the traffic splits plugin, and we have two backend services, V1 and V2, and we are trying to split traffic between V1 and V2. So we tell APISIX where V1 is deployed. We give them 90-10 weight, or probably we'll give them 50-50 weight. So if we send requests to the products endpoint, APISIX should automatically split requests between these two services, right? And we also tell where V2 is. So let's apply that configuration. Okay. So now if we go and check if there is a route, we see that there is one route within APISIX. If I yeah. So APISIX has been configured, so it shows what we just saw in the JSON file. It is the configuration. Now if we try to go to the products endpoint, you get a response from the V2 product service. And when I try that again, I get a response from the V1 product service. Let's try this for like 20 times, and you should see a 50-50 split, right? As we configured over here. So yeah, so we are getting a 50-50 split. And that's what APISIX does. So you can easily configure it through the admin API by sending requests to APISIX, and almost all configuration is just a JSON configuration. But as I mentioned before, if you are deploying APISIX in Kubernetes, you can also use Kubernetes native configuration. And you can also, if you are deploying APISIX in production, let's say, you can also deploy APISIX without a configuration storage and just use a static configuration file. So you can define what your route should look like. You can define what plugins should be applied. You can define what observability, what monitoring tools you need, how you should modify the request, how you should modify the response, what authentication, what sort of authentication you need on your routes. You can define all of that in a static configuration file as well, but you can also use the admin API when you are trying things out. Let's see. All right. So like I mentioned, APISIX is written entirely in Lua. So APISIX is built on top of Nginx. It is built on a separate build of Nginx called OpenResty, which makes it much more performant, and it also makes it much more extensible through the usage of Lua. So you can use Lua. You can use Lua to add features to APISIX. You can create your own custom plugins, and it is infinitely extendable based on your custom needs. And APISIX also comes out of the box with like close to 90 plugins, and we are also adding more plugins every day. And there are also people in the APISIX community who are also building plugins and making them open source. So it's a big thing. We are also planning to build a plugin store. We are not sure what to call it, but like a place where you can publish APISIX plugins and other people can download your plugins and like create a whole community just for APISIX plugins. And on top of that, on top of writing custom plugins in Lua, APISIX also supports writing plugins in other languages like Java, Go, and Python. So APISIX does this by using plugin runners for each of these programming languages. So plugin runners are separate, and APISIX communicates to these plugin runners over gRPC. And these plugin runners, with these plugin runners, you can run your custom code on that, and APISIX and create your own custom plugins in a different language, and APISIX will be able to work with that. And the key idea is that uh, your development teams are not forced to learn another language. They can work on something that they are all already familiar with. So a lot of backend applications are written in Java, and most recently Go and probably Python. So these developers, they don't need to change their tech stack to work with APISIX. They can use their existing tech stack to work with
Naveen,
APISIX.
in
Yeah.
gRPC, technically, we can add any other new language also, right? Because gRPC is an open protocol.
Yes,
So if
you
more
can.
people wants to use it, they can also add their plugins in case if they want to.
Yeah, even if like technically that is possible, but it is a huge task. You have to create a separate plugin runner for that particular language, and then and then communicate it over communicate with it over gRPC with APISIX. But this is definitely doable. And there's also another huge caveat here, because writing plugins and running them through APISIX plugin runners is less performant than writing native plugins. And sometimes these plugin runners, they won't support all of the capabilities of the language. So there are always issues. And to solve all that, what we are trying to do is integrate APISIX with WebAssembly. So I guess like over the last couple of years, WebAssembly has become quite ubiquitous in the browser, as well as like as a target or a compile target for a build target for most programming languages. And there is something called the proxy wasm specification, which is a standard that lets you use WebAssembly to extend the features of proxies. It was originally built for Envoy, but they made it open source, and a lot of API gateways are trying to adopt it, including APISIX. So what this means is that there is a standard proxy wasm specification, and there are also software development kits for multiple programming languages like Go and Rust, with which you can write custom plugins for APISIX, compile it to WASM, and run it alongside APISIX. And it also has, and like it improves the performance a lot, because there isn't the additional latency of that gRPC communication. And in addition to adding that performance improvement, running in a WASM VM means that your plugins are isolated from APISIX. So even if your plugins crash or something goes wrong, APISIX won't be affected, and it won't affect your traffic. It won't crash your entire system. It will be isolated. And it is also quite small, and it leaves less footprint. So WebAssembly is something that we are very much looking forward to. We just started collaborating with the Wasm Edge project, which is a runtime for a Wasm runtime for edge environments. So environments where performance and memory and all of those are quite important. So you should be able to write plugins in an increasing number of supported languages using SDKs provided by the proxy wasm specification, and use that to define plugins. And another important thing is that it will also let you switch between different API gateways if those API gateways also support the proxy wasm specification. So if you are switching from a different API gateway to APISIX, and you have plugins written in Go that is compiled to WASM using the proxy WASM specification, they should automatically be able to run in APISIX, provided that APISIX supports those features. So yeah, we are pretty bullish about this technology.
Native plugins here, Navendu. Native means anything that you are writing in Lua or C.
Yeah, native plugins are plugins written in Lua. So
Lua. Oh.
yeah. So that is still the fastest way. but Wasm comes a close second. Like it is still very high performant, and like it is always trade-offs, I guess. So you trade off some performance for ease of use, because you can use a language that you are already familiar with to work with APISIX instead of having to learn a completely new language. So
Got
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Clear. Yeah.
And yeah, like we still support the plugin runners because programming languages like Java don't have a proxy Wasm SDK yet. I'm not even sure like if someone is working on it, but we still cater to a lot of users who use Java. So the Java plugin runner project is still being worked on, but it has a lot of bugs. So and it is quite because of those bugs, it makes a lot of sense to work on the extend APISIX using the Lua plugins. But we want to continually improve it. We want support from the community, and I think that is something committees like the Java user groups can do to help APISIX, because you know what you want, you know how Java works. You are probably better at like figuring out the Java development patterns. Let's say the style of the plugin runners, the style of the APIs of the plugin runners. So you might be a lot better in figuring out how it should be built, how it can complement your existing development workflows. So those kind of contributions are really helpful. But right now, like
Yeah,
to
Navendu, I just want to be very, very clear here, because this
yeah
is one area that people are confused with. So when
yeah
you're saying plugin runners, any HTTP application, API6 can act as an API management platform, whether it is Java or Node.js. This plugin runners comes into picture only if you want to customize the behavior of API6. Am I right in my statement? Because people confuse that, okay, API6 is not at all for Java developers.
Yeah, okay. That's a very good question. Very good point to clarify. So API 6 can work with HTTP, gRPC, even GraphQL APIs. So regardless of what your backend is, API 6 talks to it over these protocols. So even if you have a Java application, a Spring Boot application running in your backend, even if you have a Python Django application running there, even if you have a Node.js application running there, even if you have a Go or a Rust application running there, API6 can work as an API gateway for it. But the benefits of the plugin runner, so let's say if you are if your entire team works in a Java space, you are using Spring Boot to develop your backend applications, and you want to use an API gateway for it. So most of your developers are familiar with Java. So instead of forcing them to work on Lua to adopt API6, they can adopt API6, and if they want to add custom features to API6, they can continue to use Java over Lua. But even but let's say like if they are using Java to extend API6, and some other day you decided to write a Rust server, API6 can still communicate with your Java applications and your Rust backend, uh, uh, similar to how API6 handles, let's say, 2 Java services. So yeah, that's a very good point to clarify. So APISIX works across the board regardless of the programming language, but you can use your specific programming language to extend APISIX. And I'll just share the link to the Java plugin runner on the chat, so you can definitely check it out. But like, to be honest, like it's not up to the mark. So there is definitely a very large room for improvement. And as you can see, like its version is 0.4.0, which means it is not at all recommended for production use cases. So yeah, And another interesting thing is like you can also use AI tools to help you write APISIX plugins in Lua. So there is an interesting article out there. I'll leave you to find it out if you are interested. And finally, like I want to touch upon the point I briefly mentioned before. So catering to enterprises is something that most people expect of open source. So API6, API 7.ai provides an entire API management suite for enterprises. It supports API6 and it adds a lot of features on top of it. And it provides you with enterprise support. So a lot of companies are using API 7 across the world. And this also helps us to contribute back to API6 and make API6 better. So people like me who work for API 7.ai work completely on the open source projects. So yeah, definitely like I just wanted to point out that there are also options if you want to go the complete enterprise route if you are planning to adopt API6. And if you are interested in contributing to API6, you can since most of you are Java developers, I will point you to the Java plugin runner project, but you can also definitely contribute in other areas. So after this talk, you probably might try API6. And if you are facing issues, you can contribute to the project by letting us know what issues you are facing. You can just come in and say hi at these in the API6 Slack channel. You can also raise issues. You can also suggest features. You can go to the Java plugin runner repo and say this is the worst. This sucks. You can do all sort of stuff, and it definitely helps us out. Yeah, I'll share a link to the place where communication happens. And I also write a lot of blog posts about API6. I go into a bit more detail, and there are also a lot of getting started articles about API6 there. So you can also check that out. Yeah, and everything else you should be able to find on the website. To learn more about the enterprise aspect of API6, you can check out the API 7.ai website. And yeah. So yeah, I understand like you had a lot of questions in between, but if you have any more questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah,
You can
I
use
have
chat or
few.
yeah.
Yeah. So first thing first, in fact, one of the doubt that I had, you also confirmed it. I'm just going with an API management platform. This itself is a new terminology for many of long-term developers, because we traditionally expose our API through either Nginx or Apache. This is how we are delivering software. Now, why do we need this sophisticated API management platform? For example, consider that I'm already delivering my application through Nginx, which is what API6 is based on. Why do I need to move to API6 for delivering my API?
Yeah, so API6 offers a lot more control of how you expose your APIs. And for the API management part itself, using an API portal or using an API management solution like greatly reduces the time you take to build your applications and serve it to your customers. So it makes the process quite quick. And one reason, like you might want to consider switching from, like, let's say a simple server. Okay, let's take the example of the Apache server, the Apache server project, Nginx and API6, right? So Nginx was built to solve a lot of problems of the Apache server. Initially, the Apache server project was ubiquitous. Everyone used that. It was the go-to way to like serve your applications to the external traffic, right? And Nginx added a lot of features on top of that. API6 adds even more features on top of that. So as I mentioned, APISIX is a different build of Nginx called OpenResty. We have a whole series of articles about what OpenResty is, what this enables, all of that stuff. But other than using just Nginx, APISIX has, like, let's say, like a lot of configuration methods. It uses etcd, which is like quite scalable. APISIX also comes in with dashboards you can use to configure. APISIX has an admin API. APISIX also has plugins which lets you do robust traffic control. It lets you do a lot of stuff like I mentioned before, like the authentication stuff, the rate limiting stuff, the monitoring and observability stuff, all sort of things. So a lot of companies, a lot of projects, when they reach this point, they come looking for a solution that can do all this, and Nginx, like just exposing your applications, just doesn't cut it. You need a lot more stuff. So that's where APISIX comes in. I believe we have a comparison page for Nginx. Let me try to find it. Okay. So yeah, so a lot more about what I just mentioned is over here. You can just definitely try that out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And another question is, actually, other than a question, just I'm validating my understanding. So far, even the rate limiting, load balancing that we talked about, we actually try to build it through, say, for example, we all are coming from Java development side. We try to do it through Java only. There is a Spring Cloud gateway that we do. But one thing is, one point in time, if you want to get into the microservice world, that we want to separate one service from Java to, say, for example, Go or Rest or something like that, then we will be limited with it because this functionality is bundled with my application logic code. So in that spaces, in that places, this will be more effective. That is what I understand. So for example, you can keep your backend languages dynamically changing. You can change it at your will. As long as you keep the same format, all your API management will be managed by APISIX. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, yes, exactly. So yeah, Spring Cloud Gateway is an example of like the Java native, Spring Boot native, I don't know, Spring Boot native like API gateway solution. And there might be a lot of use cases where you might want to stick to something like Spring Cloud Gateway, because if you are continuing on the Java ecosystem, maybe that's a better approach. Also, when it comes to Nginx, like maybe if you have a simple application, you might not want to go into the complexities of having to have an API gateway and having to configure an API gateway or manage an API gateway. So that is definitely a use case. But yeah, as you mentioned, if you have multiple services written in multiple languages, talking in multiple protocols, accessing all these different third-party APIs, needing to have a lot of observability, lot of need to be able to collect a lot of metrics, all sort of stuff, then something like APISIX, which is completely programming language agnostic, is quite useful. And my colleague Nicola, he's an experienced Java developer, and he has recently written an article comparing the Spring Cloud Gateway and APISIX. So it is totally an apples to apples comparison. It compares a lot of features, and like he's also a Java developer and he also works in APISIX. So it's pretty. It could be a pretty unbiased comparison. So yeah, you can definitely check that out.
Thanks, Navendu. Yeah, that's a useful thing that we will check.
Yeah.
So I believe, as a part of API management, the gateway is one of that, right? Not only like, Swagger, where you do documentation and all.
Yeah. So in this space, like every day I feel like there is a new trendy a trendy ecosystem name coming up. So like API management, it can comprise of many things. So API gateway is definitely one of them. An entire API management system is like a superset of API gateways. So maybe an API management system can have developer portals. It can let you like spin up and expose APIs quite easily. And do a lot of stuff more. So there is also like something called full API lifecycle management products, which cater to like things like testing, things like documentation, things like API gateways, things like portals to your consumers, all sort of stuff. So yeah, it is not really well defined what API management comprises of, but like yeah, API gateways are like definitely a subset of it.
And what kind of company should look for API gateway? Is there any guideline on number of services
Um,
or kind of
yeah.
mode?
So I don't think like there is a definite threshold, but a lot of users, I mean like a lot of users who benefit from APISIX have large scale traffic. So some of our users, like Zoom is one of our users. We have Oppo, Vivo, who are also our users. So they handle traffic in the scales of tens of millions of requests, right? So companies at that scale find APISIX quite useful. But we have also seen small service companies who use APISIX on all of their clients. So they use APISIX to route traffic between multiple APIs at a very small scale. So they are not handling traffic in the range of millions of requests. They're just handling a couple of hundreds of requests. So even in that scale, APISIX is quite useful. I guess it is about what features of APISIX you are trying to use. So for example, like even if you don't have a large number of traffic coming into your applications, you might want something like authentication or like mutual TLS or some sort of security and some sort of, let's say, observability. You might want to collect logs of requests coming into your backend services. So in all of those scenarios, even if your traffic isn't that high, you might benefit from using an API gateway like Apache APISIX.
And
Yeah, a good point, a good thing to look here is the case studies. We have some case studies on how APISIX is being used across the industries, across some popular companies that we all might know. So, and it is quite interesting as well, because like I always see APISIX being used in widely different ways. For example, Zoom uses APISIX in their integration CI/CD pipeline. So that is quite novel use case for APISIX. So yeah, it's always surprising when people use APISIX in a very novel way.
And is API gateway required in the context of monolith?
Yes, actually, that is quite interesting as well. Because there is always this debate between monoliths and microservices, and like over the past years, people have been like adopting microservices without thinking about what they are trying to do. They just follow it as a best practice. But we have realized that it is no longer true, and like people are trying to move back to the monolith. So there is a good middle ground between them, where like you can have your monolith and you can split a part of your monolith to something else. So you can have this one giant monolith and you can split a small part of it to something else. And instead of going complete microservices, you can have a trade-off between monolith and microservices. And in that scenario, like you can use APISIX to route between requests. There is another good article by my colleague called Chopping the Monolith. So he suggests a trade-off or an architectural trade-off, or like a better way to think about monoliths and microservices in this article. So it also mentions how APISIX fits into that use case. But in general, this is how you use that. Yeah.
And in the use cases, you have not talked about load balancer and all. Is that, I mean, generally, gateway is supposed to do even load balancing, right? That's what you mentioned about that splitting.
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. So there can be multiple scenarios. You can deploy multiple instances of APISIX and then have a load balancer in front of APISIX and then use that load balancer to distribute traffic between multiple instances of APISIX. So that is like the scenario when you have a very large traffic and you want to create a high availability cluster of APISIX, highly available APISIX. So that's one scenario. And the other scenario is using APISIX itself as a load balancer. So I showed some traffic splitting capabilities of Apache APISIX. So, and it can also be used as a trivial load balancer. So in such scenarios, APISIX can, let's say, do round robin between multiple backend services. You can round robin between multiple application services, or you can use complex traffic management, like you can load balance based on location. You can load balance based on a certain header. You can load balance based on different consumer groups. So you can do all of that stuff with APISIX's traffic management capabilities. So short answer, like you can use APISIX as a load balancer, but uh, in a highly available scenario, you can also have a load balancer in front of APISIX and then use it to split traffic between APISIX instances. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question.
And any paper on, yeah, like you said, when to use, I mean, yeah, now the way what you mentioned, API gateway can become a single point of failure. So in that case, you said, you can have, more API gateways and in front, another load balancer.
Yeah.
So are there any, again on the load or something, any paper on that? When to switch from this model to that model?
I have to check like if there is a recommended way, but in general, I guess it's up to the user. Yeah, like in general, it makes sense to have multiple instances deployed, but APISIX is pretty robust. We are at version 3 and like it's a pretty mature open source project. It's a pretty mature project within the Apache Software Foundation itself. So like there are very less chances where you will face issues with APISIX in production. And there is also a LTS version of APISIX, which is pretty much stable. So I guess you can think about it similar to how you use other piece of software. Maybe like stick to the LTS version if you care a lot about stability, and maybe like if you are testing things out, and like maybe you can try the newer recent versions. Other than that, like I'm not sure like if we have some documentation on when to make this switch, but yeah, but like you can definitely check out the case studies as well, because like it mentions a lot of systems at a really really large scale. So that can be some that can also be some guidance. And if you have like specific questions about your particular scenario, like we have a Slack channel, and like a lot of APISIX maintainers are always watching that Slack channel, and like we'd be happy to help you out, like help you set up based on that specific scenario as well.
And yeah, final question from me is, yes, and you have used Lua. Is that a good choice? People still feel it is good that it was a right language to be used.
In this context, yes, because like Lua is pretty easy to pick up, and the compiler used within OpenResty, which is the separate build of APISIX, is a just-in-time compiler. So there is a lot of performance improvements with using Lua in APISIX, and it is also quite easy. And for APISIX, there is a lot of, you can like reference other plugins, the code of other plugins to write your own custom plugins. And yeah, so far the community has been very okay with that. And we are hoping that in future it can switch to WebAssembly completely. I mean, like will still support Lua, but like people who don't want to learn Lua can maybe use the WebAssembly support to bring in their own programming language. I think, yeah, that's the future we are planning for the next year. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah.
Any other questions from anybody? If not, Aditya, over to you.
Okay, one doubt that I have is see, the API gateway will be sitting in front of our application. So what are the security mechanism or the security aspect of it that it handles? Like, can we handle DOS attacks, or what up to what level of security aspect that it features along with?
Yeah. So the first part I would say is the authentication capabilities. So APISIX can be, or APISIX or another API gateways can be the place where users authenticate, and then only authenticate APISIX will only allow authenticated clients to access your API. So that also adds a layer of security to that. And yeah, and APISIX can also do stuff like IP address blocking. So you can restrict your applications. So you can restrict your APIs to certain IP addresses if that is something that could benefit you. Maybe like you can detect a malicious IP address somewhere. Like, let's say if you are deployed an application in, let's say, you built an application just for Kerala, and then you find someone in Vladivostok in Russia trying to access that application, then that probably might be a hacker. So someone, a malicious user. So you can do stuff like that. And it also does stuff like it also can do stuff like cross-origin attacks, CSRF attacks, all sort of those stuff. And for things like denial of service attacks, I mentioned the rate limiting aspect of Apache APISIX. So that lets you rate limit your APIs. That basically acts like a protection barrier, a protectional barrier in front of your APIs, so that like all of these traffic does not overload your APIs and result in them crashing. So yeah, yeah, and we have like a separate category. Let me try to find this. Yeah, so in the APISIX docs there is a section called security. So yeah, so you can check out the security plugins within that. And yeah, and the other aspect of security is observability. So you want to be able to identify security issues as they happen, and that's also an important part. So observability plugins integrating with observability tools definitely help that.
And there are no admin UI, yeah? Whatever you did for, mapping, splitting and all, can all this not be done with the admin console where, we don't have to write JSON?
Yeah, we have an APISIX dashboard project, but it is fairly unmaintained, but you can still do a lot of stuff with it. So instead of using the JSON file, you can fill out a form describing what the configuration should look like. You can drag and drop plugins you want. You can configure those plugins in the dashboard and then do stuff. And for API 7.ai, we are working on developer portal. We have a different, entirely different UI for the API 7 product. So yeah, that also lets you do that. And the admin API is not the only way to configure APISIX. You can also use a static file. So instead of making multiple admin API requests, creating all of these routes by hand, you can just define all of that in a static file and then just send it to APISIX, or like deploy it with APISIX. So when APISIX spins up, it spins up with all of these configurations enabled. So you can also do that.
And any of these used in the stock market of India?
We don't know, but like but we know like we know recently like some companies, some financial companies, fintech companies and banks in Singapore and Malaysia are using APISIX, but we are not sure about the companies in India. Yeah, maybe like it's a they don't expose what is used. Like maybe they are using the open source version, but like yeah. But like in general, like a lot of financial companies use APISIX.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Navendu, for coming after a short notice. And thanks a lot, Aditya, also for hosting our first event. Hope it was useful for everybody. Navendu, we have, of course, a lot of questions about the contributions. We would love to have you in person for our Bangalore Jug meetup also. If possible, we would like to have it like on hands-on workshop if it is possible for you in Bangalore. That would be great for us.
Yeah, definitely. Like I'll be happy to host a workshop or like a live session and interact with you. Like it was really great to be here. Like all of those questions were really great. So I feel like I should have made a more deep presentation maybe, but like I guess it caters to both experienced professionals like you and also newcomers who might be watching this recording. But yeah, I hope this gave an introduction to APISIX, and I hope it probably encourages you to check out APISIX, and feel free to reach out to me or like anyone else in the APISIX community for help, and we'll be happy to help you out.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.